Tamas un kungi, labrit. That's about all the Latvian I have to offer today. But thanks to our translators, we are all able to understand each other here, which is, of course, a prerequisite if we want to communicate collectively in the present about our common past and its meaning for our common future. So my first thanks, of course, go to the translators over there. I would like to express my gratitude also to have been given the chance to participate in this very conference and in the project as a whole, in a time when some European countries and a certain percentage of the populations in nearly all of the European countries see transnational, international, and supranational collaboration as something to overcome rather than a tremendous achievement. Coming together and talking to each other, however controversial, is all the more important. In his introductory comment, Ilya Lenski summed up the 4 goals that guide us through this conference. And in light of these 4 goals, I understand my role a bit differently, so I will not give you some insight into actual research, but rather remind us of certain theoretical implications. I understand yesterday we talked about representations of the Holocaust in art, and many of our presenters mentioned the challenges of representation. I want to use this time, my time here, the brutal time, to share and remind us of some of the general skepticism that postmodern constructivist theory has brought to all the humanities for over 5 or 6 decades. This includes the implication this debate has for looking at art and artists that perished in the Holocaust, art produced during the Holocaust, and art dealing with the Holocaust retrospectively. I'm well aware that some in this room might have never heard of these positions, which fundamentally call into question historical representations, while others have spent half their professional lives or even their entire professional lives in the scientific community dealing with exactly this challenge. Hence, my aim will be to give some comments on what we are doing here from the perspective of a professional historian, or to be more exact, from the perspective of a researcher on historiography, on how we communicate about history, how we envision the past in education and society, about how we put it into use. I think that to those assembled here, it is all too clear why it has always seemed and still seems important, very important, to relate the story of the National Socialist persecution, especially of the Jews, the urgent and recurring need to prove that the Shoah, the genocide, indeed took place, and all the political implications which it has brought within context all over the globe for decades. Let us remember that the perpetrators themselves did their utmost to systematically destroy the traces of their systematic destruction by priding themselves in public of it, and creating institutions like the Jüdisches Zentralmuseum or others to preserve artifacts pertaining to those who were just being killed and murdered. Yet, while 3 generations after the end of the war, a good argument can still be made in favor of telling the story of the Shoah, the actual implementation is not all that easy, and we all know that. The major problem that we face in view of the theoretical debate that has been going on for decades is the skepticism that it entails in respect to the truth assertions of historical accounts. It is a challenge to boil down a plethora of epistemological and theoretical discussions to 4, 5, 6 minutes, but I shall attempt to sketch some fundamentals of this discussion. Much of the theoretical debate of the last half-century can be ascribed to what is called the linguistic turn, postmodernism, whatever you want to call it, that has affected not only history as a science, but the entire humanities. This shift of paradigms in the truest sense of the word stems from a reception of the close scrutiny that human communication has received in semiotics, neurobiology, cognitive psychology, and linguistics. Starting point of many who contributed to the debate is the intricate double meaning of history in many languages, referring to both the res gestae, that what has happened, and the narratio rerum gestarum, the narrative about the past. Postmodern, of course, is a problematic label, but if we choose to label it postmodern anyway, postmodern theorists stress the importance of the narrative, its social construction, and our inability to escape it. One basic rationale which most of the critics share is the contention that rhetorics win over history. no matter how detailed the historical narrative is vested in our sources or testimonies. Instead, they point to the importance of the genres of historical discourse that dominate our understanding of the past. They claim that we think history in terms of these vessels, that indeed form is content. Naturally, counter-arguments arise. Critics have criticized the loss of history, vilified relativism, even saw a proximity to totalitarian thinking. As far as history is concerned, the linguistic turn comes with an attempt to redefine the border between fact and fiction. Roland Barthes called to mind the historian's attempts to hide himself or herself from the narrative, deny their own voice a perceivable presence, and act as if history finds its own words of representation. From this perspective, many of us as historians are considered either naive or manipulators. Here, the arts come into place, and especially literature. Hayden White's main argument has been that our attempts at grasping the past are more artistic than factual. From this perspective, historiography itself becomes art, or at least artificial or artistic, respectively. In light of the global importance of the discourse about the Shoah ever since World War II, it comes to no surprise that the most outspoken postmodern critics of traditional historiography and the most influential historiographers of the Holocaust would clash sooner rather than later. Some of those who endeavored to produce comprehensive studies on the Holocaust were quite aware of the challenges of representation of such an extreme set of events. And many who were involved in criticism found finding a position on Holocaust representation the litmus test to their work. The clash did not take the shape of a war of footnotes or newspaper attacks, but the factions did indeed meet and discuss this in a scientific setting on numerous occasions in quite a polite and benevolent manner. Two important conferences are worth mentioning, one that took place in Los Angeles in 1990, one in Dornburg in 2011, which have both resulted in publications. This is not the place to reiterate these discussions and present a nuanced version of the respective positions. To sum it up, one agreed to partly disagree in past, present, and future, but was anxious to find as much common ground as possible. Thus, no one denied the necessity of a careful scrutiny of the surviving material as well as a metacritic distance to our own work. Furthermore, and this is highly important in the context of this conference, there was also the notion that more artistic and more consciously employed literary strategies should be included in our narratives, lest we feign coherent monoglottic explanation. I just want to point out, I hope I can. Nope. Yes. I just want to point out one opus that has greatly profited from that discussion, namely Saul Friedlander's books, which have earned him a Pulitzer Prize, of course, and many of you will know him. Many of you will be well familiar with them and praise them for their insights into the past, but they are also highly intriguing in their methodological approach, playing with chronology, time, and space, and setting off explanatory passages from individual accounts drawn from the sources in a particular type of montage technique. The transparency is remarkable too, and reflects in Saul Friedlander's ongoing willingness to debate his mode of writing the history of the Shoah with colleagues and the open public. And one of the core reasons why he put some of these breathtaking scraps from the sources into his greatly extended narrative is not only to give the victims a voice, but also to irritate the reader, to give us a sense of the irritation the people had at the time, but also to irritate us before we can succumb to the belief that what we have just read is a sufficient and as such a reassuring or even mollifying explanation. So if the theoretical debate on the representative power of language leads some scholars to the conclusion that any, however restricted, attempt at representing the Shoah might be well advised to put more emphasis on certain aesthetic qualities than usual, how about the role of art itself? Here, it is necessary to look back upon the development of the public arenas in which the truth claims pertaining to the Shoah were negotiated. Right at the end of World War II, with the retreat of the Wehrmacht and the liberation of the camps in the East, it was a sphere of journalism, then the field of law, and finally the field of historiography, that is, academia. Be that as it may, can we say that works of art have assumed that role by now? Are they an arena of verification? Yesterday, Eckhard Gillen reminded us of all those who have been highly critical of artistic renditions of the Shoah, such as Adorno or Lanzmann. We might even want to detect an iconoclasm of sorts in that rationale. Yet, if we take a concrete look at the audiences, we will see that works of art with a much greater audience than those which we discussed here do successfully purport that there are insights to be gained, whatever we say in the academy. A majority of the viewers will read Schindler's List, or rather watch it, as a true story. And even Inglourious Basterds, which is clearly marked as fiction, might be considered to have something to say about the past if we go back to the Aristotelian notion that fiction may carry a truer truths, so to say, than factual accounts. And it's no coincidence that postmodern scholars do find a high liking in counterfactual history. In the 1992 volume that I mentioned before, Jeffrey Hartman praises the almost total freedom of expression, quote, even if we deal with Holocaust representation. And he refers to François Lyotard, who of course coined postmodernism as a concept, who considered the gap between representation and the unrepresentable not as a defect but as a value. So there is some optimism and some rapprochement of the positions, whether art and historiography do match. You still can, however, take a more pessimistic position and follow both ways leading to skepticism. If you find both art and historiography unsuited for representing the Holocaust, the Shoah, or what you want to call it, you are left speechless. This leads us back to the notion of inexplicability, which we have had before after the war. Inexplicability, inintelligibility, however, renders Holocaust unexplainable and Holocaust education obsolete. But that's another topic that I shall not touch today, and only if you follow both ways of skepticism. In the last part of my presentation, how many minutes do I have?
You've spoken for 11 minutes now.
Okay, great. In the second half of my presentation, I would like to make some remarks on the particular role of art as a source of historical information and as a component of larger historical narratives. We have heard about the plurality of sources which are available to Holocaust studies. Ilya has called these works testimonies, and we have seen fascinating examples yesterday. I am quite ready to agree with this characterization that these are testimonies. Admittedly, though, not without commenting upon the epistemological position of testimony and the interpretative challenges they pose. It is necessary to remind us and to be aware of the most intense discussion about the role of witnesses, about the role of eyewitnesses, and the role they have for telling the truth about what has happened in education, in science, in public media. One may not forget that oral testimony is a source as well, and that is not easily accessible, and just as histories, oral accounts are representations of the past and not the past themselves. Going back to arts, postmodern critics love to detect methods and analyze strategies of authentication, deconstruct them, that is. In this context, for example, one could question the role of self-portraits and the role of artists writing. Postmodern critics are much more reluctant to accept these as willing aids to interpretation. Postmodern critics are also much less willing to having an interpretation or explanation center around the author or artist. The entire concept is highly critical in this regard. Sometimes they are looking for power structures and hegemony, not all of them, but then they also scrutinize the role of institutions, like, for example, particularly museums, archives, and memorial sites in society. We can name irritation and let it stand. We can also ponder about the relation between the circumstances of production of the work of art and the artifact which we can still see. Wilma Gradinskaite did just that when she was talking about the portrait of Jakob Gerstein by Rosa Sukova yesterday. Be it with a pre-linguistic modern or a post-linguistic postmodern turn of view, in any case, there is an urgent need, and everybody agrees on that, for careful criticism of the sources. If we look, for example, at drawings and photographs of the same event, we should avoid the notion that the photographs can stand in for reality. Photographs as well, especially if they are produced professionally, are works of art and a very selective and sometimes manipulated view on the world. And there are scores of publications on the iconic images of the Holocaust. Also, memoirs and artists' written renditions of their intentions, which we have seen yesterday and will see today probably, can be deconstructed rather than taken as a willing source of information on how we are to interpret what we see. Many trained in critical theory are also much more reluctant to employ information that an artist gives on his work. Some would even deny the concept of an artist. I would certainly not go as far, but we need to be aware that there are lots of people in academia who do not think that this is a concept that brings us any further in interpretation. But here, the question, another thing that arises, or another issue that arises, is the role of compassion that we heard yesterday as well. How much compassion, how much empathy, how much identification do we need in academia, in research, in showing art, but especially in teaching or presenting in the public? Many educators all over the world face the dilemma that learning does not work without personal involvement. Creating a feeling, and many pieces of art do just that, is necessary. But on the other hand, they want to be informative, want to bolster a rational, reflective, more distanced approach. And this is a dilemma you cannot evade.
5 minutes.
Okay. I cannot solve this dilemma, not even as a researcher. And I don't know if you have heard about this. There is, in the German or German language speaking educational discussion, there's always the so-called Beutelsbach consens, which implies that you are not supposed to overpower your audience, your teachers, your students, they participate in educational activities. But on the other hand, you want them to get involved and to share your feelings. The least we can do is be aware of the problem and the dilemma, be aware of what we are doing, be aware of our own position in the interpretation. That is, that it is not the sources that are writing the history, that it is not history that is writing history, but that it is us who do it, and that we are to be held responsible to all the ideological implications which our research and our teaching implies, even if we might lack the energy, time to delve in all the theoretical nuances and discussions. We can and should, for example, always reflect how ideas of gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, age, or ability govern our thoughts and research. We should reflect the role of the media that we use to communicate with colleagues and the public, the genres and their limitations and their ideological implications. Why is it that we are presenting this in terms of a speaker talking to an audience instead, for example, maybe having a discussion in a circle? And we should reflect the role of our institutional affiliations and the habitus this implies. Maybe we should only remain a little bit skeptical, remaining open to changing even those insights that we have worked upon sweatingly for years and years. Police, thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions? So I know that while people are thinking or formulating their questions, and Ilya has microphone. My question for you would be, you have taught so long about the historiography and how Holocaust is, and what are the narratives. So what would you think has been, for the last 20 years, the biggest change? How Holocaust narratives are displayed in museums, where the accents lies, where the focus is working with school groups. I think that it has changed for the last 20 years, but what is your perspective?
Well, of course there have been changes, and just wonder which one to take first. I think one of the most important changes, or that's more than 2 decades, the fact that in dealing with National Socialism and World War II, that we are focusing on the Shoah, is something that hasn't always been that way, of course. Yeah, so we had times when when the military history of World War II was much more in the foreground, not only of research but also of the public debate. So this is one thing. Then, of course, the globalization of the narrative. Wherever you go, somebody will have heard about the Holocaust. That's why it's maybe even better to call it the Holocaust, because that's what's the name that is famous all over the world. Especially if you look at museums, but also at education, the individual approach, that you look at biographies, that you look at the individual, just remember Raoul Hilberg, perpetrator, bystander, which of course means that you're not so much looking at structure anymore. And like in the 70s, when social history reigned, we were reading statistics rather than biographies. And of course, museums are it's much nicer in a museum context or in an educational context to use biographies than statistics, of course. And one last thing is the question of generalization. So Holocaust or studies or the Holocaust has become, even in spite of the uniqueness idea and the uniqueness of the events, it's also the blueprint for all atrocities there are in the world. So whenever you have a conflict somewhere, you will see the names like concentration camp, death marches. So it's like a foil to be counted against. So it's kind of like, can make a scale, and okay, this is like an 8 from the Holocaust scale or a 6 from the Holocaust scale, yeah? And it's kind of like this, especially in like democracy and human rights education, where you have a very tendency to come to a moral conclusion. Not always, but in some of the programs, they are very fast at gaining a moral conclusion from only like 5 minutes of dealing with the particular stories. So that would be some of the more important things I would see. Thanks.
I have a question regarding the point of criticizing our documents. Holocaust studies very much depend on memoirs about the Holocaust, which are much more subjective, given that all the memoirs are post-Holocaust, and we know how memory can distort historical facts and play different jokes with us. Whereas many of the artwork and the artwork which is presented on your screen is the actual document of the Holocaust, because it was created during the Holocaust. So what would be your personal opinion about the memoirs on the Holocaust and artwork which is from the Holocaust era? Your approach. Thank you.
First of all, I don't think that I need a personal opinion on that, in fact, but if we are still going back to rationality, and you mentioned it, memoirs do play as jokes. And of course it's, if you have, I'm nigh on 50 years, and I have experienced myself lots and lots of instances when my memory has betrayed me. And speaking to successfully survivors, some of them are very aware that this happens, of course. Some of them aren't, and it's always, if you're in an educational environment, it's very hard to find a middle way between respecting the person and what he or he is telling, and trying to induce the audience to still be aware of what is happening. You are absolutely right that the source value of what we are presenting here sometimes is much higher. But it's a different quality, especially like things from the Ringelblum archive. Yeah? So the voices that we heard that are alive, of course, those that have survived through coincidences very often, whereas some of the things that have perished and have only survived are things that we have from those people who indeed have perished. So that's a different quality. But still, I was trained in medieval. It's like as close as you are to something, it still is mediated. Yeah? Even we talking now, this is like there's about a time lapse of 2 seconds, so that's the past. So communication is you cannot escape communication, even at that time. And of course, those were views on what was happening at the time. But then every source is a view on what is happening at the time. So there's a proverb, I cannot do it in English. Da beißt sich die Katze in den Schwanz, is it in Germany? Yeah, so it's okay.
I just wanted to mention that in Latvia we do have diaries, and also in Germany and Poland, that were written during the Holocaust, and in many cases by people who didn't survive. They were writing as it was happening. In this museum you can get memoirs of Rivoš, of the artist Rivoš, and also there's a text, an exhibition from Shane Gram, who was in Preli, writing just before she was killed. So it's we do have these testimonies.
There is, of course, these testimonies, but I think that's the question of immersion. Very often those who work the most with these documents can become so close to these documents, talking to the person in the first-person narrative. So it's not like Anne Frank's diary, but it's Anne's diary. Yeah, and so this very close interaction with the document sometimes leads to a certain loss of distance, of cognitive distance, which I would think sometimes necessary. But that's like a déformation professionnelle. That's just what happens to all of us when they are dealing with something for 20 years, obviously. But sometimes we just have to be aware of that.
Before giving Mike, I'll utilize that I still have it. I have a brief question.
You always do that.
I have a brief question following on what was just discussed. How do you, well, in your professional activity, or can you reflect on how do we overcome the gap between us today and what we want to extract from the, first of all, in artistic documents, but also, let's say, memoirs or diaries, and the fact that what we have are just scattered remains that mostly have survived by chance. So how we understand that the view we have through it, it's very much distorted, so-called survival phenomena, so we know only the story of those who survived, their personal feelings, so, or in small number of those who perished but whose legacy has survived. So how do we overcome that, and how do we explain to people that it's only a small portion?
First of all, we do not overcome it. We never do. But we don't do it doesn't work even if we are like, I've been tried as a medievalist. If you look at Viking thought in the 10th century, like, you know, all these people who wear the Thor hammers and think they know something about Valhalla and all this, it's about the amount of information we have on this, it fits on the screen. Yeah, so it's, there are times when we have, indeed we have the Shoah is one of the better documented things that we have in history. I mean, just you can take several lifetimes to go through the documents. It's not that we have a scarcity of documents. Of course, what we have is, and this is what we call in German, Überlieferungszufall and Überlieferungschance. The chance of transmission is different. Like if you're certain types of documents have better chance of survival than others, of course, and this is something you have to remind yourself always. But this is something you have to do as a historian in any subject. That's not particular to the Shoah. But there's a gap. Yeah, face it.
Great presentation and great questions. It seems like the tension between art and science continues, but the other question is whether you can articulate what the crisis of Holocaust education is currently and what the map of Holocaust education looks like going forward. I mean, it seems like the narrative is rigid. It also has to do with Holocaust denial. So how do we take into consideration Holocaust denial and how we want to teach?
That's not a 60-second question. Sorry, but thank you for the question. Wow, yeah, okay. How to do this in 60 seconds. You're absolutely right that many of the people in Holocaust education, if you want to call it this way at all, because there's some countries where you don't like the term Holocaust education, of course, and both the Holocaust and the education part. First of all, it's both varied and not varied. So the globalization phenomena that we have in media exist also in education. Then we have the trend to well, that's a negative word. I don't know how to put it like positively, but to use it, maybe not instrumental, but to use it in contexts of everyday human interaction. So there's a tendency to learn from the worst of the worst examples for everyday life. And I'm not the only one who is not quite sure whether this is really a good idea to have people learn about how to behave or not to be racists, or to live in a democratic way, to show humanity. The question if it's pedagogically a very good idea to start with the worst of worst examples to learn like how to have a better moral behavior, whatever. So that's one problem. Then it's two things. First of all, everybody we are dealing with in an educational setting has heard about the Holocaust before in different settings. So it's not like it's whatever your educational endeavor is, you are not alone, and the people you're working with already have formed an opinion, many, especially in Europe and the US, of course, have a personal approach of some kind, have some kind of link, or many links that are there. And one thing I just slipped my brain. It's gone. It will come back in 5 seconds. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, thank you to you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.